All right, folks. This is maybe a hot take in and of itself before we discuss hot takes, but I kind of feel like we can just turn this into a hot take podcast because we cover a wider variety of topics in every episode. If we, or in the last episode, for example, if we take the hot take approach, and I also feel like in some ways, these are more representative, as I mentioned to you, of our normal conversations. So maybe instead of just saying that this is a hot take uh, episode, we just every episode is a hot take episode, and we just title the episodes the things that we talk about. So that's just a hot take for now. Um, we'll see how this plays out. But anyway, jumping right into things. So if I had to kind of, it's a little bit muddy how I can simplify this one. What I would say is that there's just to preface it, there are a lot of exercises that people do that are promoted as like pain reducing exercises or XYZ joint health exercises, shoulder health exercises. People will make a post and say 5 exercises for elbow health, right? Or elbow tendonitis. And this is going to kind of be something that speaks to all of those types of things. And a recent example, I was having a conversation with someone, or really just a brief back and forth, and he was doing this single leg dumbbell RDL. And what I noticed, and he was using over 100 pounds in the dumbbell, but this is also someone who can deadlift over 700 pounds, squat close to 700 pounds. Very, very strong person. And what I noticed in the RDL was that he was basically like every other rep, he would kind of fall over and have to sort of reset. And so I asked him just directly, like, hey, dude, why are you doing it this way as opposed to in a more stable environment, right? So, for example, you could just gently place the other leg on the ground. He was doing it where one leg was on the ground, the other was kind of, going up and down, and he wasn't grabbing anything else with the non-working hand. So it was basically just like in free space, hip airplane with a dumbbell sort of a thing. And so when I asked him why he wasn't making it more stable, he said, um, in essence, that this was a variation that reduced his back pain. Just globally across, all different kinds of programming strategies. This was a particular variation that when it is in his program, he feels like it reduces his back pain. And he kind of speculated that maybe there was some kind of placebo effect, something mystical about the exercise, was my impression. And I think that this is a great representation of the overall picture that I'm trying to paint here, which is a lot of the exercises that are espoused to be for XYZ health or XYZ, tendonitis function, whatever it happens to be. It all kind of just comes back to me to the concept of just like how much total stress am I able to create with this exercise? And a lot of the times, what you find is that the exercises that are espoused in these ways for health, for function, for joint support, whatever, is they're oftentimes just very, very load limited by the constraints of the exercise. And that doesn't make them bad or useless. And in fact, it might make them useful in some cases. But the overall take here is that almost every single exercise that people are doing for quote unquote health is just some kind of variation that is substantially load limiting in some capacity. And so in some sense, what you're doing is you're kind of you're creating a hard stop on how much you can progress that exercise, which in the context of hypertrophy, I think is in most cases a downside. So another good example of this is like people will talk about how they'll go from doing barbell RDLs to cable RDLs, and they'll say that the transition from barbell to cable RDL was one that really helped their back pain. And the way that a lot of people set up cable RDLs is they grab a cable, because usually the constraints of a cable are that it has to be in front of you, and they kind of step back away from the machine, right? So the challenge in that exercise mostly is just trying not to fall over forward more than it is actually loading the hips. And so what people then falsely assume is that there's something mystical about that particular variation that makes it better for back health. And so then you end up with all these different exercises which are labeled, which have a stamp of this is for health, when in reality, I think any health-based exercise most of the time is just an exercise that is inherently load limited. And just one other example of this that's maybe more broad is in sport. So you see a lot of professional athletes doing these kinds of exercises, balancing drills on Bosu balls, right? Where, maybe someone is doing a split squat on a Bosu ball. Or maybe, you see this a lot in baseball where you'll see guys doing like single arm pressing exercises and like a split stance, right? With a cable. And it's kind of like, oh, this is tremendous for our athletes. This is keeping our athletes healthy, when in reality, maybe it's just like you could just do more traditional variations with like intentionally lighter loads or just intentionally lower efforts. And you could get more of what you do want from a specificity standpoint, um, while not having to sort of like go through the circus juggling act of setting up these sort of crazy stability circus related exercises. So, again, a common one in baseball is single arm press, like with a dumbbell lying on a bench. Another common one is kind of like stepping away from a cable stack, getting to like half kneeling and doing a single arm row. And again, the overall take is just simply that oftentimes what we're seeing is just a constraints a scenario where you just simply can't use that much load. And again, like if someone's really not willing to um, view, let's say, like a traditional exercise through a little bit more of a mature lens of like, hey, if I'm an athlete, I don't have to like do this barbell bench press with max effort for 3 reps. I can just, do 8 to 10 reps. I don't have to make it that hard. Like people seem to be very uncomfortable with the idea that they can just kind of, especially if they're an athlete, do things at lower relative efforts. Um, and people seem to be uncomfortable with creating constraints around the load that they use, when in reality, I think people are just better off sort of going with the more traditional approach and maybe reining it in and being a little bit more thoughtful about like, hey, I don't have to use as much load as I possibly can. So the overall take there is that there's no such thing as a health exercise. There are only exercises which are more or less load limited, depending on how they're set up and how they're executed, and that we should not confuse those two things or conflate those two things as certain exercises being magical fix-all solutions and other exercises as being inherently dangerous or sort of counterproductive to health-related goals. So I don't know if you have anything to sort of add on to that or challenge about that, but that was that was where I wanted to start in the sort of intensity related conversation.
Yeah, when I think of health related behaviors or recommendations like in other categories, you could say, for example, in nutrition, people might recommend, eating a little bit of salmon every week, or taking a omega-3 or algae pill or something. They might recommend, like antioxidants through fruit and vegetables or phytonutrients. They may recommend like getting out for a walk in nature, getting some sunlight, things like that that are recommended as now like almost supplemental behaviors to our normal lifestyle. And the premise there would be that we're lacking some specific component based on the behaviors that we engage in our modern environment, right? So we take less steps than we used to, we get less sunlight than we used to, we get less time in nature, we get less omega-3 fatty acids, like this sort of stuff, right? So the idea of supplementing with specific nutrients or behaviors is to kind of make up for things that we are lacking from just an evolutionary context. And when we fill some of those gaps, oftentimes we see benefit, like measurable benefits to health, and then that kind of confirms the theory. So I would think the concept here would be that if we're doing exercises for orthopedic health of this particular segment, it's because there's something we've identified as lacking, or out of balance with what we're considering normal or requisite for just day-to-day life, or the needs analysis of a particular sport. So I think this is one area where there is just a lot of like people going off of anecdote, and there's not a lot of strong data to support like, well, what is this person lacking, like what are the requisite things and the requisite amounts of these things that a person needs to function at a high level for their given environment. So I
Right.
think it starts with like this needs analysis, and you know, some people make that sound really easy. Like once we do this needs analysis, we can pick these exercises. And in your particular case, you're saying, well, if we know exactly what we need, let's just go train those things more specifically. And we can probably be more efficient if we tackle those with a higher degree of specificity. And then from the other end, it's almost like the compound versus isolation stuff. They're like, well, let's just get, multiple benefits out of this one exercise, and we'll fill all the gaps. And we don't really know what muscles need to be trained, but we need to train these patterns. So we're going to train the patterns instead of muscles. But the issue I see is that it's so hard to identify truly what is needed from a needs analysis standpoint, and in what magnitude those things are needed, that it's almost just like, anyone's best guess, and we're kind of going off of anecdote. So maybe you could give more clarity to like how you go about identifying specifically, you know, what a person needs in this situation. Otherwise, we're just kind of relying on, the Eric Cresseys and the Mike Boyles to say like, I do split squats and I do chops, and these are patterns that people aren't doing, and it's just this like 10,000-foot view that needs a lot more specificity. It's kind of like I talked about in the last podcast with like stress and recovery. When we're that broad, oftentimes it's just because we have a lack of understanding of the topic. Um, but also sometimes that's all people have to go off of. And it's very similar, again, to that conversation, and also to the compound versus isolation conversation, where it's like when you are uncertain and you're in a place of, I don't mean this in a negative way, but like of ignorance, where we just don't really know what to do. We just kind of rely off of anecdote and what people have done in the past, i.e., most of what bodybuilders are doing, right? We don't have a whole lot of research. We don't have any research on, guys in my position. So much of what we do is just based on anecdote. Do you have any just like commentary on that, and how we can at least start to turn the dial towards being more specific rather than just sort of relying on the anecdote of the gurus?
Hmm. Yeah, it's always such a tricky conversation because the term need is so subjective. Like you hear it oftentimes baked into the questions that kind of sound like, um, well, how many different exercises do I need to do in a session for my chest to grow? It's kind of like, you know, for my mom who's never lifted, we can do a modified push-up for a couple sets. For you, who's an IFBB pro, we probably need to do more of that. So I kind of feel like it's just more so about identifying a starting point and being okay with expressing uncertainty about that starting point. And then for every person, assessing whether or not they are moving toward a desired outcome based on where you've started, right? And this just gets more and more complicated, like in a sporting scenario, because everyone has these theories about like, well, if you're a pitcher, in the MLB, and you're exposing yourself to these patterns, like, should you strengthen those patterns and make them more resilient, or should you like go into this other bucket that's less specific so that you can acquire skills and improve the strength of muscles that are maybe less well developed in that particular pattern? And I can see it being the case that it's actually could be either one of those things for any given person. Um, I can also see it being the case that it could be a blend of those things for any given person. So to speak to maybe like more of a hypertrophy context in bodybuilding, um, I'm reminded of like the general volume recommendations of 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, which I think by and large is like not a bad starting point for a lot of people. But I do think that when you're doing things with the level of specificity that, let's say, you are, those recommendations start to fall short because what you need based on the way that you're doing things can look very different than what someone else needs based on the way that they're doing things. Um, so yeah, I don't really have a particularly good answer or model to that particular question, but I do find that in the experiences over time that you have with someone, those kinds of things just start to emerge in let's say like ways that are maybe less direct, that is intuitive. So for example, like in a bodybuilding context, it may manifest as, I need to grow this muscle, but what is the rate limiter to growing that muscle for a particular person? To the conversation we had before we started recording, for a lot of people it may just be the quote unquote health of the joints and the perception of pain or lack thereof around a joint. For another person, what they need may have nothing to do with the exercises they're doing, and it may have much more to do with their lifestyle outside of the gym. So no, I don't have a good answer to the question, but I do think that it is something that you discover for yourself when you really pay attention to the inputs and the outputs of a particular program or framework or model of training over a much longer period of time. So I guess that where I would end up with that for any given person would really start with where they want to sort of end up, and then just making a best guess, and seeing how that best guess goes. Like Tom Brady, swears by the resistance band training methods, which clearly seem to quote work for him and give him what he quote needs. But maybe he could have done that in 20 other ways that were more efficient. But can you really argue with the outcome of like what Tom Brady has managed to produce over his career, or someone like what LeBron James has managed to produce over his career? Like you can't really. It's hard to argue against the anecdote in those cases. But I do find that those cases tend to be the ones on the fringe, just by definition of like their being elite athletes, you know?
Yeah, I mean, my hot take in that realm is that strength conditioning at that level is one of the least important parts of the organization in terms of winning championships. And that's coming from someone who went to school.
Yeah.
Literally, strength conditioning is written on my degree. Um, but it's interesting, like the best strength conditioning program that I'm aware of in the NBA has, a pretty subpar team overall. And, I set up the head of one of the better teams in the NBA in a conversation with the head of this other team. And he was blown away at how much they were doing with their program, how, far ahead they were of his team and all the other teams in the NBA in terms of the stats they were using, the training methods, the organizational structure within strength conditioning. But at the end of the day, getting the right parents and, drafting the right players and paying them enough. Like there are so many other relevant factors that influence the bottom line of how many games you win and then, how people perform in the playoffs. I just think it almost becomes like obviously it matters, like injury rates matter a lot, but probably more often than not we're doing more harm than good. And it's just like being neutral is probably better than most people are achieving in strength conditioning. Just as
Mm.
I don't know, I'm not in that realm. I used to be in that realm, but I'm just observing at a very, very high level, like the best strength conditioning programs don't usually produce, don't don't have a high correlation with the most winning teams. So
Hmm.
just the fact that it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Obviously we're doing this, we think it matters, but I just think there are a lot of more high tier things that have a big impact. To just like looking at genetics versus a training or nutrition program or whatnot. Like you got to eat and you got to lift weights, and if you want to be a pro bodybuilder, in the open class you got to take drugs, but um, you know, Ronnie Coleman and Kai Green both turned pro and were, you know, better than I am right now naturally. So there are
Yeah.
other things.
And I also am kind of reminded just in that strength and conditioning comparison of like a lot of times the people who acquire, and this, of course, there are exceptions to this, but a lot of people who spend a lot of time acquiring knowledge and a skill set in a particular domain fall short in other areas. And so they are kind of forced to go an alternative path because maybe genetically, for whatever reason, they weren't predisposed to a particular outcome. So for me in particular, like I was someone who was always getting myself injured and not seeing a ton of progress from what other people told me that I would. So I went the direction of let me see how deep down this other rabbit hole I can dive to see if I can pull things out of that rabbit hole that um, can allow me to progress because these other things aren't working. So it's kind of like if you are not a particularly high performing team in a collegiate or a professional organization, maybe the reason that organization dives deep into that route is because of the fact that they're not particularly good, rather than it being more like more so the idea that those things don't make much of a difference. It might be like maybe they are making a difference, but just the magnitude of difference is not substantial enough to override those initial shortcomings of the genetics of the guys on the team, let's say. Um,
You see this dog right now? Let's see. You got a good look at that?
oh yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit hard to see, but I can. Oh,
I
there's a
didn't
cat too.
I didn't think I could flip my camera around, but while you were talking, he was just like digging himself a bed and like arranging the pillows and
Maybe that's what people need more of. Yeah.
super comfy right now.
Figure out a way to relax better instead of figuring out the perfect shoulder health exercise. All right. Anyway, this is a good transition point into maybe like the intensity conversation that you brought up.
Sure. So taking a taking a right hand turn here. All right. So my next hot take is training quote intensity quote is overrated. Right. Now we first have to define training intensity. And when you and I were in school, I mean, I'm speaking for you, but I believe this is probably the case when you're reading training textbooks on, periodization and whatnot. Intensity was defined as a percentage of one rep max. So 90% training intensity is a heavier weight than 85%. Maybe you could do 4 reps instead of 6 reps. And it's sort of like a dimmer switch. As you turn up the training intensity, you're approaching the maximum of what you can do for a single repetition. As you turn it down, you can do more repetitions. You're using less load. So really, it was just a proxy for how much load you were using. So when in Olympic lifting, powerlifting, when the term training intensity was historically used, it was the intensity relative to your maximum, your 1 rep maximum. Now it's more common to use RPE and RIR. Now, RPE, when I was in school, was also much more centered around an endurance training context. So it's interesting how some things kind of make their way from endurance to to strength training, and sometimes they get sort of like mispurposed. They get misused. And like one example was with like nutrient timing and endurance training. there was a high focus on like restoring glycogen levels, and they would consume a lot of carbohydrates post training. And we saw that there were some benefits there as far as like quickly replenishing glycogen levels if they did it around the training session versus hours post. And then bodybuilders took this concept. They saw maybe like protein synthesis was a little higher, but we know now, over a decade post, we've known for a while that like nutrient timing is not a high priority when it comes to building muscle mass. Maybe not a zero, but not a high priority, because we're going to essentially get enough glycogen back in the muscles to be perfectly fine the next time we do a training session, which is going to be like the following day. And even then, oftentimes we're not training the same muscle group again. So it just kind of becomes irrelevant. Now, when it came to RPE, we were using something called the Borg scale, I believe, which is basically just like subjective uh, fatigue, subjective effort, like on a treadmill test, usually, like if you're doing a VO2 max test. And it could be like a 0 to 21 scale, which would essentially just track pretty nicely with your heart rate at any given time. So it's like a 220 minus your age equation is just has its own story behind it, but it's just kind of a super rough, usually wrong, but close enough estimate for maximum heart rate. So if you use a 0 to 21 scale, you're basically capturing most of that range in increments of 10, as far as like, how hard someone's going on an endurance test. So if you weren't measuring their heart rate and, they said, okay, I'm a 15 out of 21, maybe their heart rate's around 150 or so. And then that scale oftentimes just became like a 1 to 10, just rating of perceived exertion. And that scale got carried over into resistance training, and it was more so rate your session and tell me on an RPE scale how difficult was that entire session. So chances are, if you were like, it's really hot in the room, or maybe you're doing like higher reps and you're not used to it, you give it a higher RPE rating, essentially like you just felt more messed up, after the session. And then along came RIR much later, which was, much more of a specific proxy for the tasks that we were doing. So heart rate's, pretty good proxy for intensity when it comes, to an endurance training. It's not the only proxy, but it's one pretty decent one. And it's because we're looking at the heart, and we're talking about cardio, they're pretty directly tied to each other. But when you're talking about how messed up you feel, and we're talking about resistance training, there's not a direct one-to-one, correlation with what happened at the muscular level, and how fucked up do you feel based on the temperature of the room, like how pissed off you were when you were training. Like all that stuff has pretty high magnitude of effect on just how tired you feel. How are the people around you responding? Are there people watching you while you were doing it? Did you sleep last night? Like the amount of things that go into your perception of effort are wide and varied, but don't necessarily speak directly to the local muscular fatigue and thus sort of adaptation you're going to get out of that session. So over time, as we moved into more specifically counting the total stress of a session, the term volume changed a little bit. Volume really, and there's still a lot of people that say, a lot of bodybuilders, when they say volume, still mean higher low reps. So most like enhanced bodybuilders, when they say I train high volume, that aren't in somewhat adjacent to like the evidence-based crowd, when they say high volume, they actually mean I just train with higher reps. And when they say low volume, they mean lower reps. So there's still a lot of people that use those terms in that context. The evidence-based crowd, really just based on like one article that came out on Stronger by Science, again, probably like a decade or so ago, started using volume to denote how many sets you were doing for a given muscle group. But again, that's also a pretty new thing. Volume, like historically, even when we were talking about strength training, where they moved, from talking about intensity to RPE, when they talked about volume, it was still kind of like, well, high volume just meant like more metabolically demanding. But now when we say high volume in strength and hypertrophy, even in the literature, high volume denotes more sets. So this is just kind of some of the history of these terms of volume and intensity and RPE. And now we combine this term volume, how many sets you're doing, with RIR, how close to failure are those sets? And we kind of have a loose definition of failure, just like we have a loose definition of sets, but we're moving in this direction. Like, because we can't put a monitor on you today and speak to an individual fiber, or a group of fibers, and say, like, this is the stress that's been imposed, and this is the appropriate time to cut off that stress. Maybe at some point we'll get a blood sample or a muscle biopsy, probably not a muscle, maybe a tiny muscle biopsy is probably a bad idea, but maybe there'll be some type of marker, probably some like DNA methylation or something that can tell us, if we've done enough. Because that's always the question. Like, did I not do enough? Did I do enough? Have I done too much? Like, what's the right amount of stimulus? And we're seeing with more and more research that potentially over the moderate term, a lot of different ways of achieving the stimulus of muscle growth, can be used. So there's many roads to Rome, so to speak, at least in the way that, at least under the conditions that we're measuring it in the short term. It seems to be all equal. Maybe we'll find out later, oh, it's equal zoomed out, but maybe we're growing, different components, or there's benefits to doing, a particular amount of each type of stimulus. Who knows? But right now, from the zoomed out view we're looking at, it just seems like a lot of different ways of training can cause this adaptation of an increased lean body mass or increased muscle fiber size. So getting back to this RIR conversation, we have a loose definition of what we call failure, and it's basically like observing concentric failure, or this task failure of not being able to finish the concentric portion of the rep, either in what's called volitional failure or momentary muscular failure. Volitional being the person doesn't think they can do another rep, or momentary being when they actually fail. Now the load starts moving the other direction. So that's what we call failure right now. It's not equal between exercises. It's not equal under different conditions. There are lots of places that it's not equal. But we loosely defined, okay, we can quantify the total volume with what we observe as sets, and we can quantify the total effort by reps in reserve or proximity to what we observe as failure. And then we come back now all the way back to this term intensity. And now the way that people are using the term intensity has also changed a fair amount over the years. So the way that I see the word intensity being used in modern context, I would define as the amount of strain that a person is outwardly projecting. And that really is more of this initial RPE concept. It's basically like someone's observing you, or you're, reflecting on your own effort, and you're just saying, man, I felt really fucked up when I did this. So when people say this person trains at a high intensity, there's some degree of looking at the correct variables that measure reps in reserve, but there's really no context around what exercises they're choosing, how they're setting it up, how they're executing it. All the variables that go into the local muscular stimulus are often missed when we're talking about training intensity. So really the outward thing when we're saying, okay, Branch Warren trains intensely, it's mostly out of he's sweating his ass off because it's 100 degrees in Metroflex. He's screaming, he's getting slapped in the back of the head. And now the reality is, like, he's doing a lot of sets. He's training at a high volume. Many of his sets do not feature a ton of reps in reserve, but also the context really matters. You watch him do every set of dumbbell rows, and it always ends with an explosive eccentric, which is throwing the weight into the floor. But other than that, like, is he within a few reps of failure by the last set on a dumbbell row? Probably. But if instead of a dumbbell row was an exercise that was more matched from a resistance profile perspective, would he be able to, uh, get more total tension for those fibers in his back if he was using an exercise where he could get more output and he wasn't limited by the constraints of the exercise itself? Yeah, of course. But it looks way more intense to do a dumbbell row in 100-degree heat and throw the weight into the floor while people are screaming at you and slapping you in the back of the head. So that's what training intensity is to me in the modern context, is just the observation of strain. And although I think that actually has a lot of benefits in the real world that we can't rule out in terms of just creating an identity, creating community, probably relieving stress in a lot of ways. Like, there are probably a lot of benefits that, much like the example we gave in pro sports, that maybe even outweigh the concept of the local muscular fatigue. And then, of course, there's an interaction between that and training volume. So if you do enough sets, you probably find your way there anyway. And people who tend to train with a lot of intensity or the outward projection of effort also tend to carry over that intensity to everything they do. They tend to come from a place of being highly motivated and sort of, having that proverbial chip on their shoulder. So there's a lot of confounding variables in terms of how they live the rest of their life and the total amount of effort they put in. But when you're breaking it down on a granular level, I think we have to separate the perception of strain and the local muscular stimulus that you're getting. And I think that local muscular stimulus is indeed different from all of those concepts of training intensity as defined by percentage of one rep max, training intensity as a concept of strain, RPE as basically your own perception of your own strain, RIR as, again, the perception and the observation of not being able to, complete a task. These are all different than the local muscular fatigue you're getting. And I think it's really a separate category that, much like this concept of identifying the limiter for an athlete, is a place we're just not fully able to measure right now. And a lot of it is just behavior, like psychology playing out in the real world, to just like the right person with the right genetics and the right environment does more, gets, makes it to high levels if they can survive it.
Would you say that the would you say that it would be a fair comparison to make between the two conversations we just had of dumbbell row compared to a quote unquote match profile row? Like, that comparison you could make is somewhat similar to the comparison you could make between something like single leg unsupported RDL versus single leg supported RDL. In other words, could you make the case that all of this is a spectrum of whether we're talking about profile or something like stability? All of it leads to what allows you to do more, and that in some cases, like in the dumbbell row, the limitation that it provides insofar as it allows you to create tension in the back versus a very well machine matched row. Would you say that those two things are comparable, if you kind of get what I'm
Yeah,
pointing to?
yeah, yeah. But then it's just like, because we're human beings, the concept of believing, this is an exercise that relieves my pain, believing this is a hardcore exercise, the kind of gym that you train in, when you do heavy dumbbell rows, and the people you're surrounded by, the environment that you create when you do a rehab exercise, like, we can't separate any of that stuff out. And in practice, a lot of that stuff may just have greater implications than we give it credit for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Now, this is something that I thought of as you were, or was just reminded of, and whether this is a hot take or not, I'm not exactly sure. It will depend on where people are coming from, but a lot of people now, so just to backtrack, when more and more research seems to over time be pointing to this idea that like tension is the main driver of hypertrophy response, uh that sort of was a transition that initially came from talking about factors like the pump as being maybe a primary driver of hypertrophy. And to be honest, it doesn't seem like totally clear how related to the pump is. Of course, there are many confounding variables insofar as like hypertrophy outcome. But I was just thinking like the pendulum has kind of swung on this. In other words, let's say 10 years ago, people were really fascinated with the pump and they said like the pump is the main thing, the whole Arnold thing of like the pump is, better than sex. And so if you get the pump, like that's what we're after. Versus now, like a lot of quote science-based people are saying the pump is useless. Don't chase the pump because the pump is bad for hypertrophy. I don't I kind of feel like I made that change a little bit where initially I was like really focused on the pump as a mechanism. And then I was hyper focused on, okay, the pump doesn't matter. It's just about tension. But now I've kind of returned to this place of like, I kind of feel like chasing the pump in most cases is not a bad like rule of thumb. I'm not saying that like it should be your guiding light of decision making and exercise. But would you agree or disagree that for a lot of people, chasing like getting a sick pump in the target tissue is not a particularly bad idea?
Mhm. It depends what you trade to do it, so if it's in the context of you're still able to measure progressive overload in some way. So you're still able to measure, in other terms, progress in some way, whether it's more reps, more sets, more weight, whatever. Um, then I think the pump can be used as a proxy. I don't think it even really matters, like from a practical application standpoint, whether it's like entirely tension. It's not going to be entirely anything. Like
Yeah.
nothing in the body is going to be entirely anything. But when I use the word tension or training load or local muscular stress, it's just to imply like there's a milieu of things that are going on that essentially like when you do more, you get more. And I don't think it matters so much with the information we have now to sort of like break out the mechanisms because they're sort of impossible to separate. It's like we only get a pump by creating tension.
Hmm.
So, like, the only reason you're getting a pump is because you're occluding blood flow. So the blood is pooling in the muscle. But in order to occlude blood flow, you have to create enough tension in the muscles to cut off venous return.
Hmm.
So they're sort of like one and the same, but I think the pump could be a good proxy for tension. It can be a good proxy for hydration. It can be a good proxy for what muscle you're actually training. So I think in practice, it's more of a proxy. And I also think it's a good way to just limit the amount of orthopedic and sort of emotional stress that you're taking on in a session, or like I use the word arousal oftentimes in this case, which is just to say that like when you're training for a pump, uh, that when people say that, they are usually talking about something that's a little lighter. They're usually talking about something that they're moving oftentimes a little slower. Maybe they're holding in certain positions. And I don't have reason to believe that that would be significantly worse. You just need to observe that you're making progress. It's not that you need to create the progress by writing. It's not that you create it by like writing it down on paper. You do a stimulus. You drive a particular stimulus, and then sometime later you observe the progress in the fact that the next time or at some point you're able to do more. So I think you need to be able to observe in some way that you're making progress, but how you make progress is not quite as relevant. So you just need to set up a program that allows you to observe whether or not adaptation is occurring, which is going to be mostly performance driven, simply because we don't have good measurements for muscle growth, like on an acute scale that are practical on an individual, like n=1 basis. If we did, I wouldn't even measure, like performance wouldn't even be that relevant. Performance might just become more like the pump in this situation. It's kind of a proxy. We want it to be there. Like it's only relevant to the point of like um, it tells us maybe something like on a very acute basis. But what I would be more interested in is if we had a proxy that was, or if we had a direct measurement, either within a session or even as short term as a few months of just telling us whether or not we are growing in the process of growing or have grown uh, muscle tissue, that would be way better. I would much rather look at that. But since we're way off from that, even though people might think, oh, because in research we're using MRI or we're using ultrasound, in practice with a given individual over any like uh, length of time that would be meaningful in order to make program changes, we're just not using any direct measures of muscle growth. So the best thing we really have is performance. So I think when it comes to, within a session or between sessions, like you still want to make sure that you have some gauge of whether or not adaptation is occurring. And then how you want to get there is your decision. And you can probably titrate the amount of stress on particular systems based on the choices you make. So if, particular joint structures are limitations, maybe, an example of getting a big pump here would be using BFR. We've seen, at least in the condition study, that BFR seems to be as good as traditional training when it comes to muscle growth. So that would be one example of where you could get a big pump. And again, just make sure that you're measuring something. It doesn't even have to be that exercise. It could be another exercise that doesn't hurt. Maybe like you're doing BFR on one exercise and then you do another exercise after that without BFR, and you're just observing progress on that, but you're not even counting reps on BFR. So like a good example of how I implement this in my own training is we've talked before about how I'll record the repetitions that I do in a separate place from where I record the weight and the settings and everything, so that when I do a particular set, my goal is to do each rep as well as I can do that rep, but in the context of I'm still trying to get my best performance out of that set. And I may do 16 reps on that set. And then at the end of the training session, I'll move that number 16 to the bottom of my note where all the rest of the reps from earlier in the block are recorded. And I'll go, oh, last week I did 15 reps. I'm observing that adaptation occurring. Now, obviously, there's a lot of moving parts, but if I'm doing 16 and then earlier in the block I was doing 10, when you look over really long periods of time, you're like, okay, my form, my tempo, all that stuff couldn't have deviated that much, for beginning to block and end to block. And another thing that I do to account for that and to touch on the topic that we're talking about here of like the pump and sensation and internal focus, and not necessarily like measuring the output acutely, but still observing adaptation, is the second set I'll do after that. I don't count reps at all. And what I try to do is just get the biggest pump, the greatest sensation of just like control on the eccentric, pausing in the places where I feel it's appropriate based on the exercise I'm doing. But I'm not counting reps at all. I'm just trying to create a sensation with still a moderately heavy weight. It's usually about 75% on average of the weight that I use for the first set. And then that pretty much always ends up being more than, say, 50% of my one rep max. Um, so on that second set, I don't count, even if I'm doing a unilateral exercise, I don't count reps at all. I just try to make it feel as stimulative as I possibly can. And oftentimes it'll be less reps than the heavier load that I used prior. So that's how I'm currently conducting my own training. And I think it's a good example of when I come back the following week or weeks and I do that first set again, I observe the adaptation occurring when I look back at my training log at the end of the session and I record the number of reps. And obviously what I'm doing in my training is leading to that, but I don't necessarily have to be counting reps on every single set to observe that adaptation happen.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this will kind of transition nicely into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is something you and I have definitely talked about a bunch of times, probably a couple times on the podcast, which is this like, and I think I maybe even mentioned it last week, this distinction between strength and hypertrophy, like when writing programs. Um, I guess it's not as much of a hot take as it is a point just to make on strength and hypertrophy and how we look at these things. But whenever we're talking about programming for muscle growth, to your point, we can use strength as a proxy, like as an acute proxy, especially just because we don't really have many other things to assess, especially in the short term and even in the long term. It's impractical for most people outside of just subjective appraisals of their progress to measure progress. So I feel like it's important just for people to remember that anytime that you are doing a hypertrophy program, you are also doing a strength program. Like there is not some sort of huge distinction between strength and hypertrophy in the sense that strength as a proxy and as something to measure is always something that is occurring when you are training for muscle growth. I think people just have this idea that like there's this very black and white distinction between something that over here is strength and something that over here on the other end is hypertrophy. When in reality, to me, anytime that you are doing a hypertrophy program, you are doing a strength program, right? Or at least hopefully you should be in some sense. And that strength is not just particularly, it's not just something that's particular to specific motion. So I talked about this last week, I think, with like people viewing strength as being synonymous with squat, bench, and deadlift. Um, but I do think there is an important point to be made on the other side of that, which is that if someone is training for quote strength, the only case in which it makes sense to really make that designation is when someone is training for a particular performance outcome like a power lifter or a weightlifter. So in those cases, the sort of endpoint that you're after is strength in these activities, but strength in all exercises that you do is still something that is as relevant in the context of hypertrophy training. And I think that most people, when they say strength training, they're also referring to hypertrophy training when they mention that, at least 99% of people. And so I think it's important not to really make a super strong distinction between the two, because oftentimes I feel like it leads to people when they talk about like hypertrophy to really not give a shit about the load that you're using and the progress that you're making on particular exercises. And then conversely, when you look at strength programs for particular motions or specific athletes like powerlifters or weightlifters, people look at that as this is a strength program and this has no relationship to hypertrophy, when in reality there is still overlap there. So I would say like, and the analogy I use a lot is the squares and rectangles analogy, which is that um, all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares, which is to say that all hypertrophy programs are in essence strength programs, but not every strength program, if it is really specific to a sport, is a hypertrophy program. Does that distinction clear in terms of what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, we didn't do, did we do this as a hot take last week? I don't want to be redundant on anything, but I think this is like a good topic to finish on.
No, I think I indirectly mentioned it as part of a hot take last week when we were talking about, I mentioned squat, bench, and deadlift,
Okay.
but I think it will be
So I think the
valuable.
hot take is this: there's no such thing as a strength program because strength is an amalgam of things, right? Like this,
Hmm.
you can have this adaptation of more muscle growth, and you can train individual components of strength, but strength isn't one thing, and it's really just this observation of like an end outcome that is specific to the task. Like there's a high degree of specificity to it. So it doesn't really mean anything when you say strength. Like, so to your point, if you ask someone on the street, do you do strength training? The average person doesn't differentiate between hypertrophy training or squat, bench, and deadlift, or how your mom trains, or how my wife trains, or whatever, right? Like that's all. If you're picking shit up and putting it down, it's strength training. So that's like the average person's take on it. If you ask, someone listening to this podcast, or someone who's in the powerlifting or bodybuilding scene, are you training for strength or you're training for hypertrophy? When they say I'm training for strength, what they typically mean is I'm training for a higher 1 rep max. And usually that's in the context of the back squat, deadlift, in barbell bench press. So in the context of what you're talking about here, like strength in terms of the output you're getting on any particular exercise is highly specific to the exercise and to the rep range that you're doing it in. So it's really just about what you're practicing, because there's lots of bodybuilders, like a classic example is Tom Platz and Fred Hatfield doing their like squat off. Fred Hatfield was the strongest, squatter in the world. Like I believe he squatted like 1,000 pounds or somewhere in that, realm. But he was like the strongest squatter in the world at the time, or at least very close to it. And Tom Platz had the biggest quads in bodybuilding. It was probably the best squatter in bodybuilding when it came to higher rep sets. And neither one of them could hang with each other in their respective realm. So Tom Platz could do more weight for 20 reps, and Fred Hatfield could do more weight for 1 rep. So who's stronger? Right?
Mhm.
Most people would say Fred Hatfield's stronger because he can do more for 1 rep, but that's just simply based on like historical context and has more to do with just like a pretense that you have, not necessarily what is strength, because strength is just so non-specific. And it's like I kind of suck at like moving furniture, but if you put me on like a leg press, leg extension, row, like just break down any of the component parts, I'm going to be really like in the top, the, the top percentiles of that. So, am I strong? There's a lot of situations where I'm going to look pretty average, or at least, only slightly above, like let's say average amongst like other trainers. Like when we're carrying equipment up the stairs, I'm like not that much more valuable to have than the next person. Certainly not by the margin of strength difference that I display on exercises that have a high degree of stability or restraint. Um, so it's just kind of like an amorphous uh, word to use without just having specific context. So you're never really like training for strength, or you're always training for strength in a sense when it comes to resistance training. But it just requires a high degree of specificity to find, what the task is.
There he is. Yeah, and I think that an interesting point to be made about that is that there is kind of this dual nature to strength, which is that in one sense, it is a really broad, generalized term that is an amalgamation of 10 different things in any scenario. But in another sense, it's also hyper specific because there are so many components to it, to that scenario. Um, a good example, I mean, a really good example in the Fred Hatfield Tom Platz distinction. And on another level, I could say, um, if I'm doing a triceps extension and I have the cable aligned in such a way where, let's just assume we don't have to be hyper specific about the scenario. Let's just say I'm grabbing it with my hand and I'm using 50 pounds on the cable stack to do the extension. Uh, and I do 10 reps with that versus if I anchor the cable somewhere on my forearm and I use 70, 80, 90 pounds and I do 10 reps. Am I 70, 80, 90 pounds strong or am I 50 pounds strong? Like I'm both and I'm neither. you know,
Yeah.
um, to the point about it being an amorphous concept. So kind of one of those things that we can be like endlessly pedantic about, but at the end of the day, what people mean is really like, what is my output in terms of what I can see on the weight stack in this activity? How much can I bench? How much can I deadlift for X number of things? And I think that's useful, but not really true. Like it's useful in terms of how we can use it to measure progress, but it's not true in the sense that you can change any part of any one component of the exercise and all of a sudden it's a totally different outcome.
Yeah, and how do you compare it between people? Like people are moving different distances.
Yeah.
Like the distance that one person has to travel to complete the concentric portion of a deadlift is completely different than the next person based on like limb lengths, for example. And then as per our conversation separately the other day, like, well, what's the strength of a muscle, versus just this output that we're seeing on a movement? Like there's so many different component parts that are going into this output that we're observing. So yeah, just to sum it up, uh, strength is very non-specific as a term, but in terms of using it practically, you have to be very specific about what you're measuring when it comes to strength, and it's going to be different, between individuals, between tasks, between setups. So it's really just its only real practical use is for a competitive environment where you're just saying, okay, here's the task. We're not going to worry about how you got there, but just simply the person who can, put more load on the bar for this task is going to be deemed, the stronger person. And then in a hypertrophy context, gaining strength is still just very specific to the task that we're doing. But in this case, we're only comparing it to our prior efforts. And at this time, it's probably the best proxy that we have for if you are gaining muscle. But just because you're gaining strength faster doesn't necessarily mean that you're gaining muscle faster. So it is something that is probably somewhat of a requisite observation, but not entirely. It's probably a useful thing to be able to observe, to say that we're likely gaining muscle, or we're you can't even say that you're not gaining muscle, but if you are getting stronger and it's not just simply because you haven't practiced a given thing, it's not like a skill driven improvement, then you likely have the ability to gain muscle. Whereas, um, if you're not getting stronger, it doesn't necessarily mean that, or if you're not observing a strength increase, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be gaining muscle either, but it is a useful proxy in terms of hypertrophy to say that like it is possible that muscle growth can be occurring.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. And just to finish it up, I'll add that if you really understand the intricacies of torque and what torque is versus what force is, you can really throw people off with how much strength you can demonstrate on a particular machine or exercise just by manipulating things that maybe a lot of people don't think about, such as moment arm or such as stability or how you pull on a machine, um, things like limb length. Uh, to use an example, I was training with a friend last week who has a wingspan. He's basically my height, but his wingspan is like 6'4". It's just like Slender Man arms. And we were doing this reverse fly thing, and he was using like a fourth of the load that I was. But in most other instances, like I wasn't that much stronger than he was. And so it was really like an ego hit to him until I explained to him that, I just showed him the difference in our arms and potentially what that might mean. And so then he felt much better about being, a lot weaker in that particular exercise. So it can go both ways. Point is to say. All right. So we'll see everyone next week and the following and the following and the following on the modern Meathead experience.